Okay, well, let's make a start until people will be still joining, as always. But it's my great pleasure to have Ellen today with us, Ellen Boucher, who is a research associate at UEA with us now. And Ellen's done her PhD as well at UEA with Michael Gray. And she's done a master's before that at Queen Mary University. And she's really interested in head injuries and heading in sports and how it can potentially increase the risk for dementia. And Ellen herself is very passionate about football, very keen football player. So it's great to have you, Ellen. And as always, Ellen will give a talk for roughly 45 minutes. After that, there will be time for questions. So if you want to come online or if you want to type it in the chat, please do. But I'll hand over now to Ellen. So thank you for coming and presenting to us.
Thanks, Michael. I'll just get my slides up. Can you see those okay there?
Yeah, you can see that perfectly. Thank you.
Fantastic. Thanks, Michael. So as Michael said, I'm Ellen. I'm a research associate at the University of East Anglia. I'm currently working in dementia research, and today I'm going to present some of the work that I did for my PhD, the topic of which was monitoring the long-term consequences of contact sport on brain health. So today I'm going to go through a little bit of the background to the research, and then I'll give you an introduction to the project that I worked on called the SCORES project, as well as an update on some of the initial results that we got from the study and also the results that went into my thesis. And I'll then talk about some of the acceptability work that I did around it and also the work ensuring that the online measures were valid. And then I'll finish by talking a bit further about how we can build a diverse database in this research field. So to start with, to give you a background on some of the research. So some great news for you all. We all know that sport and exercise are really good for brain health and our long-term brain health in particular. We know that participating in physical activity or sport lowers our risk of diseases that contribute to dementia risk, like diabetes, heart disease, obesity, and cancer. We also know that taking part in physical activity reduces physiological risk factors for dementia, such as inflammation, insulin sensitivity, cardiovascular factors, and also that it promotes neurotrophic factors, neurogenesis, and neuroplasticity, which in simpler terms are the brain's ability to heal itself, to grow, to learn, and to support a healthy brain environment. And then the third point is a really important one, is that we know that taking part in sport can reduce our social isolation and improve our social support structures, which are very important towards our dementia risk as well. However, we also know that sport can be a risky business. So in research, particularly sports science research and sociological research, we know that there's a well-documented culture of risk in sport, in which athletes weigh up risky decisions and risky behaviours and their ability to reach their maximum performance in sport. So in particular, this can lead to musculoskeletal injuries, so things like broken bones and pulled muscles and sprains, which can ultimately lead to absence from work, school, training, or competitions, and also in some cases financial costs as well. But overall, these injuries are and can be life-changing, but not necessarily life-ending. However, we are beginning to understand in the research that some injuries have long-term consequences. So an example of this is that exposure to repetitive knee injuries through sport can lead to an increased risk of osteoarthritis. And in a similar way, and of particular concern, we're now seeing that exposure to repetitive head impacts can influence our long-term health. So this is leading us to understand that growing evidence suggests a link between exposure to repetitive concussive and subconcussive brain injuries and increased risk of dementia. So when I'm talking about concussive injuries, I'm referring to any impact to the brain or body that results in movement of the brain, resulting in presentations of symptoms within hours or days. And then when I talk about subconcussive brain injuries, I'm talking about head injuries that don't show immediate symptoms. So they sit below the so-called threshold of concussion. But cumulatively, we know that these have long-term consequences and they affect the way that the brain can look after itself and stay healthy, and also how we age as well. This isn't a new concept. We've known about a sort of description of symptoms called punch-drunk syndrome since 1928, when the term was first coined by Martland, referring specifically to the cognitive signs, the mental health signs and behaviours of former boxers. It was later related to dementia when it was termed as dementia pugilistica in 1937. And then in 2005, around that time, we started to see the emergence of the term chronic traumatic encephalopathy, which is a reference to the type of neurodegeneration that we see in the brains of former contact sport players, as well as military personnel, and also people who've been exposed to violence as well. So in 2005, this term came up a lot because this man here, Bennett Amalu, he found evidence of neurodegenerative disease in the brain of a former American footballer. It was a pretty high-profile case at the time, and it challenged the way that we consider brain injuries in sport. It's also covered by a movie called Concussion with Will Smith in it, so that's a bit of a plug for that movie. It's not the best, but it does give you an outline into how the way that we thought about this problem changed around that time. The problem is with CTE is that it's only diagnosed after death, so we can't recognize CTE in someone who's still alive at the moment. So as researchers, we don't tend to use it when talking about people who are still alive, but instead what we're really looking for are signs of abnormal declining brain health more generally. And then another high-profile case came out a couple of years later when Dr. Anne McKee was leading her team and looking at the brains of 111 NFL players, and she found 110 of them had signs of CTE. Since this came out, further brains have been examined, and they're now at a rate of about 92% of the brains they've looked at have signs of CTE. But this is ongoing work, and it's also a brain bank that's really important to this area of study. And then in 2019, here in the UK, we had the publication of the field study from Glasgow University. This was a study that was funded by the FA and the PFA to look at the health records of former professional male footballers. So the type of information they get from these health records is things like hospital visits, GP visits, prescribed medications, and causes of death, but not really that much information about how someone presents other than that. So what they did in this study was they compared the health records from over 7,000 footballers to 23,000 matched control samples who were similar to the football players in terms of age and also socioeconomic status. And when they looked at their cause of death, what they found was when it came to things like heart disease or lung cancer, the former football players actually fared better than the match controls in that they had a reduced risk of dying from these diseases. However, when we look at the data for the neurodegenerative disease causes of death, we actually see a 3 times increased risk of neurodegenerative disease in our former football players compared to the matched controls. So although we see the positive effects of taking part in sport and physical activity in the reduction of heart disease and lung cancer, we also see the negative consequences in terms of higher risk of neurodegenerative disease. So this was a pretty big deal of a study when it first came out, and since it's been replicated, not just in the UK, but also in other countries like Sweden, France, and Italy. And it adds to this growing body of evidence about how we can establish whether exposure to repetitive sport-related brain injury can increase our risk of dementia. So we're now at a stage as researchers where we're asking whether it's possible to establish this relationship. In 2023, the Concussion in Sport group met to discuss this, having reviewed all of the available literature to date, and also having heard from experts as well. And this group is essentially a group of clinicians and people who work in sport as well, who meet approximately every 4 years to review all of the research out there on concussion and then design policies or recommendations that are actually used by clinicians as well. And what they decided essentially in 2019 or in 2023 by reviewing all of the evidence to date was that we can't really establish this yet. And it's not because of a lack of studies, but it's more because of a need for larger study populations where we can adjust for other factors that might influence health. So things like genetics, also behaviors like smoking and drinking, as well as physical activity, and also the presence of other comorbidities as well. So other diseases that might influence dementia risk, like diabetes, for example. I've put the reference down there in the corner so you can check that out if you want some further information about it. But essentially, this is a reference document for clinicians. So they're around the world being told that we can't establish this link yet and further research is needed. So this brings me to the SCORES project. We have been running since October 2020 in partnership with a lot of the people here. And we're essentially an online longitudinal project, which is designed to monitor the brain health of athletes as they age. We were set up before the Concussion in Sport group meeting, but we designed our study to essentially answer a lot of the key questions within the field. And one of them is surrounding collecting a diverse sample group where we take measurements of multiple factors that can influence brain health in the long term and also answer key questions in the research field. So I'll explain now a little bit about how we do that. So in the study, our participants are men and women aged over 40 who have been active in sport and who do not have a diagnosis of dementia. So they're technically a healthy population. We're unique in that we include firstly men and women in our study sample, and also recreational, amateur and professional athletes from both contact and non-contact sport as well. In our study, participants complete cognitive, behavioural, mental health and sleep measures online from home. So to do that, they register at our website. They complete a consent process and also a demographics questionnaire. And we also gather at this point quite extensive information about their sport and health as well. So in these sport and health questionnaires, we collect factors like age, ethnicity, education, deprivation, so basic demographics. We also collect information about the type of sport they played, the level that they played, the age at which they first started playing the sport, the duration, and also the main positions that they played if it was a team sport. We also gather information about known or diagnosed concussions, and also because concussions are typically underdiagnosed, we also collect information about suspected concussions too, and as well as any other traumatic brain injuries too that might influence performance on our tests. And then finally, we also collect information about health comorbidities, so whether or not people have diseases like dementia, for example, or also whether they have learning disabilities or mental health conditions that might influence their performance on our tasks too. So we get quite a wide range of different factors that we can adjust for later on in our analysis to see whether any of these other factors might also be influencing performance too. So once they've given us all that information, we then ask them to complete 2 sets of brain health questionnaires and thinking tasks every 6 months. So they repeat it twice per year. And we ask participants to stay in the study for as long as possible, but ideally at least 10 years. So we get a really long and large data set from this group of participants. So this is an example of one of our tasks, one of the online thinking tasks. So this is a measure of executive function, which is a type of thinking that helps people to plan, organize thoughts, solve problems, and carry out tasks as well. So this is an example of the trail making task B. There's trail making task A and trail making task B. B is the harder version of the assessment. But in this task, participants are asked to connect the circles, which contain numbers and letters, in ascending order, switching between numbers and then letters, and then back to numbers again. So they would go, for example, 1 to A, to 2 to B, to 3 to C, and so on. And because this is online rather than a traditional paper and pencil task, we get far more information. So we get the total time that it takes to complete the task, but we also get information about the reaction times for each response as well. So we can monitor things like any dips in attention or any parts of the task that they struggled at. And we also get the number of incorrect responses as well. This second task is the picture recognition task. So in this assessment, participants are shown a series of images that appear on 4 different parts of the screen. And after they've seen this series, they're then shown a second series and asked to confirm whether they saw those images before. So for example, with the cookies, they didn't see them. But with the lemon, they would say yes. And then the second part, which is the spatial memory part of it, they would be asked to identify where on the screen it appeared. So for this example, it would be on the left-hand side. And then this third task here is the virtual supermarket task, which is a measure of spatial navigation. We're really interested in spatial navigation within our study because it's an area of thinking that's affected in the really early stages of dementia. And given that our population is aged between 40 and about, I think, over 90 now, we're really interested in those early stages as much as we are the later stages too, because any information we can learn about how changes in thinking appear in that early stage will help us to understand earlier diagnosis and earlier identification of any thinking problems too. So in this measure of spatial navigation, participants watch a video of a trolley going around a supermarket, so quite a familiar experience. They're then asked to identify using the dial here where they started in regards to where they end up facing at the end of the task. And the second part of the task is to trace their path on a bird's eye view of the map. And so we get 2 different measures of spatial navigation here as well. These are just 3 examples of some of the tests in our assessment battery. I didn't want to go through all of them, but they give an idea of sort of the wide range of different types of thinking we're interested in. And on top of this, we also measure things like mental health, behavior, and sleep as well. And then what's unique about our project too is that we actually offer our participants feedback on their performance on our thinking tasks. And this is a really important part of our investigation because from the start, we were really keen to give our participants the ability to monitor their own brain health too, and to empower them to take action if they start to feel like they're not doing so well or they want to check up or anything like that. And we give them signposting as well. And this has been really effective within our study strategy. And I'll talk about it a little bit later in this presentation. So this brings me to the results from scores that were included in my thesis. So when I got to data analysis, we had 328 participants who had completed their assessments. Of these, we had 192 males with a history of contact sport. We had 9 males with a history of non-contact sport. And then we had 9 males who reported that they didn't complete any or didn't participate in any sport in their lifetime. For the women, we had 44 females who had participated in contact sport, 49 from non-contact sport, and 25 who reported no history of sport. And then we also asked them about level of sport that they took part in. And for our males from contact sport, we had 77 professionals, 103 amateurs, and 12 recreational level. And for our females, we had 5 professionals, 36 amateurs, and 3 recreational players as well. So for my thesis and also for the paper that we're putting together with this data, it was really important that we could choose appropriate control and exposure groups so that we could make comparisons to try and isolate the effects of contact sport on brain health. So for our males, the way that we chose to do this was by comparing our professional contact sport males with our amateur contact sport males. Because this would give us a sort of gradient in terms of level of exposure, assuming that the professionals would, over their lifetime, have more exposure to contact sport than the amateurs. For our females, we were really lucky because we had the ability with our group sizes to compare contact sport females and non-contact sport females. And this is really positive because it means that we can almost completely isolate the effect of contact sport in this comparison. So this isn't possible with our males because obviously we have such a low number of non-contact sport males, but with our females, we had this really great opportunity to do this. And then the third type of analysis we did was a normative analysis. So we actually had access to data from our software partners from other studies that had used the same tests as us in a similar healthy population. And I'll come to that a little bit later. So this is what it looked like. So these are the results from the trail making task A and B. So B is the harder version of the task, A is the easier version. It's a measure of executive function. And in our darker colors here, the darker bars, we have the male participants, and the lighter bars represent the female participants. Along the x-axis, you can see the different exposure groups. So for the female comparison, that non-contact versus contact comparison. And for the males, the amateur versus professional comparison. And then the y-axis is time to complete the task. So in this assessment, the lower time or the faster time indicates better performance on the task. And then you have your error bars and also the asterisks that represent significance as well. So what we see here is firstly in the trail making task A, we see that our female contact athletes are actually significantly better at the task, so they're faster at the task than the non-contact athletes, which is kind of counterintuitive to our hypothesis, but I'll explain it a little bit later. We see the opposite with our males in the darker bars. So we see that our male professionals are performing significantly worse on trail making task A, and you can see that trend as well in trail making task B too. When we look at the picture recognition task, so this was the memory task where they saw images on 4 different parts of the screen. We have the y-axis, which is percentage correct, so the higher, the better. You can see across all of the 4 outcomes from this task, most of our participants do really well on this task, and they get 100% nearly all of the time. So this told us that it was probably too easy for the most part. But when we look at spatial memory, particularly with the male data, so this was the outcome where you had to say where on the screen the image appeared. You can see that the professionals do significantly worse than the amateurs. So they are getting less correct in this task. So there still might be some use for this assessment within our study battery, but this was sort of the purpose of this task, to figure out where we're seeing any differences. And then finally, this is the virtual supermarket task results. So you can see again for the start deviation, we see with our men, the amateurs are doing significantly better, so they're showing less deviation than the professionals here. But we actually see the opposite of the effect for the females too. And the reason why I think we're seeing this in the females is actually probably because of an age difference. So we saw that our contact sport athletes were about 5 or 6 years younger than our non-contact sport athletes. So there's a potential that this could be explained by age differences. But because we collected so much information about all these different factors that can influence our brain health, this is now a focus of our analysis to sort of make these adjustments, and so that we can tease out whether this is really the effect of contact sport or if it's actually the effect of another factor as well. So that's ongoing at the moment. And then you can see in this last figure here is that with our second part of the virtual supermarket task, we're seeing very little deviation. So again, this is a part of the task that was probably too easy for our healthy participants here. We also looked at mental health. So we used the PHQ-9 and the GAD-7, which are 2 questionnaires, and they're the questionnaires that are used by most clinicians in the NHS to get a general assessment of how someone's mental well-being is doing. We see again that our participants score really quite low on this, and it could be a reflection of their mental health, but it could also be a reflection of how comfortable they feel reporting these kind of things online. So again, that's an area that we're quite interested in. And we see the opposite effect here, actually, in that our contact sport females have higher scores on the PHQ-9 and the GAD-7 than the non-contact sport, so they're showing worse mental health, whereas the opposite, it seems to be happening for the males. So our professionals are reporting less mental health symptoms than our amateurs. But again, this could be linked to things like socioeconomic status and other factors that might influence these mental health outcomes as well. So that's an area of interest for us too. And then finally, we looked at behavioral health too. We chose to look at aggression and impulsivity because from the reports of how former contact sport players present in person, these were 2 areas of behavior of interest. It seems to us that our participants don't show a lot of difference in these areas, but this is an area where long-term follow-up will be really key to see whether we see any changes over time as well in these behaviors too. So the third part of our analysis was to compare our results and scores with a normative sample. And we did this here in the example of the trail making task A again. So we've got our female participants, in particular, our female participants who took part in contact sport in light blue here. And then we have our male contact sport participants in the darker blue. And the normative sample, or the normative mean, is represented by the dotted line that goes across the bars. And then we've split them by age group. So for the males and females, we have an age group each for 40 to 49, 50 to 65, and 65 plus. What we see here is really interesting because in our youngest age groups for both males and females, we see that our scores participants do better than the normative mean on the task. They take less time to complete the task. But for our older participant groups, we start to see this trend that indicates that the older participant groups do worse on these assessments. And we see it again in our trail making task B, which is just the harder version of the task. You see the younger participants do better on the task than the dotted line, the normative mean, and you see the older participants do worse on the task. So what we think this is potentially showing is that in our younger age group, we see these positive effects of sport in young age, but then we see the negative consequences in older age. So now what we're really interested in is trying to pinpoint, when does that change? When do we see that switch from the positive effects of sport changing to the negative consequences of contact sport? So this is what we're following up on now. And then here again, you can kind of see that the bars are all pretty close to 100 on this picture recognition task. So again, it's indicating that this task was probably too easy. So I'll just skip over it. But again, here you can see the effect that I was talking about the younger age group showing less deviation and the older age group seeing more deviation. So this is really interesting because it's kind of in line with what some of the other studies have shown. So for example, the field study identified that there are many benefits of taking part in sport. And I think our data also supports that as well. But it's also highlighting some areas of thinking that are or seem to be affected in the long term because of a consequence of taking part in contact sport. So we're now compiling it for publication, and we'll also, in that paper, consider the adjustments as well. But those are 3 assessments from our battery that sort of give you an indication of what we're starting to see and the patterns that are emerging in our data as well. So the next part of my presentation talks about some work that went on as part of my PhD, but sort of around the SCORES project. So I conducted some further work on acceptability and validity of taking part in the SCORES project and also of online methods in particular. So acceptability is basically how participants in the study perceive taking part in the study. And it's really important to us as researchers to look into because it can tell us a lot about how we recruit participants to the study and also how we can keep them in a long-term study too. If you remember, we're planning to try and run this study for at least 10 years. And to do that, we have to be able to keep participants interested and keep them regularly logging in and completing their tests. So for my PhD, I did some background work to try and understand ways that we could do this. So acceptability as a framework is concerned with a lot of different things. So for example, things like affective attitude, how someone feels about the intervention, the level of burden of the intervention or methodology, the ethicality, so whether it sits in line with their expectations of ethicality, whether they understand the study, whether there are any benefits to taking part in the study, or whether there are any costs as well. How effective they think the study is at measuring what it's trying to study, and also then finally self-efficacy, so how well they think they can take part in the study as well. And we can measure this prospectively, so looking at how participants feel about future studies that they haven't taken part in yet. Concurrently, so how they feel about studies that they're currently taking part in, and then also retrospectively, so how they feel about studies they have already finished. So we were interested in the concurrent and prospective acceptability of scores. So I conducted interviews with 8 participants who had completed one set of scores assessments. What we found was, in order to improve recruitment, participants felt that highlighting personal and altruistic motivations was really important to the study. So there were people who reported that they chose to take part because they wanted to give back and help the next generation of athletes. But there were also participants who wanted to learn about their own brain health, so they were taking part for more personal reasons. And they also identified that computer literacy and also fear of seeing decline on feedback forms could be barriers to recruitment as well. So that was really helpful information for us. In regards to retention, so keeping people in the study, participants valued the clarity of instructions. They wanted regular non-intrusive contact. So they wanted to be reminded that they had assessments to complete and wanted updates on the study, but they didn't want to be harassed essentially to log in and complete their tests. So this was an important balance for us to consider when communicating with our participants. We also know that the participants found the assessments to be of low burden, which was good. And they wanted a promotion of a community, so to speak, within the study. So they didn't need to know who else was taking part in the study, but they wanted to know about the scale of the study, They wanted to be informed about the results. They wanted to be informed about any kind of sidelines of investigation as well, and to kind of feel like they were part of something as well. And then and really importantly for us, they identified that the feedback process would be very important to their participation. So we launched the study before we had started the feedback process. And as I'll show on the next slide, we used information from the study to inform our ethics application for the feedback process as well. So in general, this study was really important to us because at that early stage, it gave us information about how we could improve recruitment, retention, and also the feedback process. We used that information to improve materials that were participant facing and also to think about different groups that we could target for recruitment. We used it to improve the instructions online and also the availability of the technical support. We launched a study newsletter with regular updates about what we were doing in the study, how recruitment was going, and also at the time it was during COVID. So a lot of things like healthy activity ideas and how to feed yourself well and things like that. But that was all the kind of things that our participants were interested in hearing from us as a study team. And then finally, we used this information to inform our ethical procedure or our procedure for applying for ethics to run the feedback process, which was really helpful because there were a lot of concerns from our ethics committee about the feedback process, and being able to back it up with evidence from our participants was a real strength in our applications as well. We then repeated this study after 5 assessments. So we ran a second acceptability study asking similar questions, but to try and understand a bit more about how we could keep people in the study. What we found from this, this was a slightly smaller interview group. This is only 7 participants, but they reported continued acceptability of the online format. It was still a low burden approach for them. They experienced mixed difficulty of the tests, which was in line with what we found in our results as well. And also what they were doing reflected their expectations of what they had signed up to do as well, which was all good feedback to receive. They also highlighted the importance of the feedback process, and this was after we had run a year of the feedback process. They importantly found that it met their ethical expectations, and a lot of them reported that it was very helpful for them to kind of check in with their own performance too, and use it to inform whether or not they wanted to get a follow-up checkup with their GP. As part of this work, I also looked at the validity of using an online method. So we know that online research has so many advantages. It reduces cost and time. It allows a wider reach of recruitment. It allows us to reduce the burden that participants experience, and also it allows them to complete assessments in a more comfortable environment. And at the time, because of COVID restrictions, one of our priorities was also making sure that we were sticking to social distancing requirements. And so an online research study was perfect for this. But really importantly, in using online studies, we need to make sure as researchers that the validity of methods is retained in the process. So to look at this, I ran a mixed methods study. So I took participants who were new to the SCORES project and invited them to complete a 2-stage initial approach. So they either completed online thinking tasks first and then in-person thinking tasks, or the other way around. And then after this, I followed up with an interview to learn about their experiences. What I found from this, quantitatively, so comparing the results between in-person and online, firstly, this comparison was slightly limited by our sample. We didn't quite get the sample size we wanted for it. We did find a moderate correlation between in-person and online assessments. We also found some effective initial testing condition. So for example, if someone performed if someone completed the tasks in person first and then online, they did better in the online second condition than if they did it the other way around. So it sort of suggests that a hybrid model might be effective and that there is some benefits of an in-person initial session. And then in our qualitative results, we found that participants had a preference for the online setting because of increased comfort and also low burden. We also found that their performance was dependent on computer literacy and also instruction quality too. And then finally, their comments supported what we found from the quantitative results in that this hybrid offer might be preferable for long-term studies to sort of reduce the anxiety of doing online tasks, especially with people that don't have a lot of experience with online measures. So these are all learnings that we've kind of taken and integrated into the study and also kept in mind when thinking about the validity of online results. So I'm going to end by talking about this concept of building a diverse database. So towards the beginning of this presentation, I talked about how this area of research has a fair few limitations in that a lot of the study populations are based on male former professional athletes, and they're not really diverse in terms of level of sport or in terms of including female athletes. As a coach and also an amateur football myself, this was a priority of my research to try and work out ways that we could focus on female athletes and include them better in the research. So women are underrepresented in this research. There are very few studies of female athletes in this context, and those that are available are limited. This is concerning because females have an increased risk of concussion than males. They also experience more severe and prolonged concussions than males. And we know that women are at a higher risk of dementia worldwide. So it's kind of shocking that they haven't been included as much to date. Unfortunately, this was kind of reflected in our participant group within scores. So we obviously collected far less females than we did males within the group. But an interesting thing that we identified in the very early days of recruitment was that not many female players were reporting themselves as professionals. And this is kind of an obvious thing in hindsight because our recruitment criteria is that you have to be over 40 to take part in the study. And for female athletes, professionalization wasn't available until sort of the last 10 years or so. So it's really unlikely that we're going to get athletes who report themselves as professional within that cohort. This was kind of supported by a conversation I had last year at a conference with a female athlete who had competed for Team GB. And she said that when she sees research studies that advertise looking for elite or professional athletes, she doesn't sign up for them because she's never been paid to do her sport. And it's a real shame because obviously she has the training experience and the exposure to the sport. But just because of that one definition, she's excluding herself from this research. So we were really interested in learning a bit more about how we can better include female athletes in this research. And we wanted to use the word elite to describe them rather than professional. So we wanted to know more about how the term elite had been used in other research as well. And I'll just go through this quickly. But essentially, we designed a review that was looking at variation in the use of elite in sports science research, and also historical markers that can identify different eras of elite as well. We used studies of female footballers based in the UK for some consistency, and also they had to be referred to as elite within the full text, and elite needed to be defined within the full text as well. I think I came across about 70 studies that used the term elite, but had no definition of what they were referring to when they were saying elite. So that's obviously just really unhelpful from a research point of view. And then the results were reviewed by myself, a researcher, a football administrator, and also a former professional footballer as well. And briefly, what we found was 147 sources where we identified that the definition of elite has changed over time in these research papers. To essentially, in the early stages, there was more of a reliance on international level and top national leagues, whereas in more recent papers, they're using the term elite to refer to even the third national league or even below. I'll just skip over youth for time, but we also identified some markers of change within the literature too that could inform our development of a definition of elite, which is what we've designed here as a working definition to apply to our cohort. So we're currently publishing a paper for this, and I'm sorry I've had to skim through it, but what I would recommend is when we've got that out there, maybe taking a look at that to see the kind of logic behind this. But essentially what we were trying to do here was come up with a creative way to solve this problem within our research field of finding a way to have a more dynamic definition of elite that could be applied across different cohorts, so that we could make more accurate comparisons, especially when comparing between male and female athletes. So to kind of conclude, overall, my work for my PhD firstly found that there are positive effects of sport on brain health, and also supports that there are some negative consequences of contact sport on brain health in both male and female athletes. We also found, after 1 and 5 assessment sets, that participants find the online study format meets their expectations of acceptability and ethicality. And really importantly, we found that feedback to participants about their performance is really important for recruitment and retention. And then we found, again, some factors that might influence the validity of online research that are important to consider. So what's next? In this research, we opened quite a few questions for us. So firstly, we're going to perform some long-term follow-up. We've been running now for 5 years, so we've got quite a good database that's running. We're also going to facilitate a sex difference comparison, so comparing male and female athletes appropriately. We have the framework to do this at Scores now, so that will be really interesting to work to come out of this project. We also need to look further than the professional athlete and look at amateur and recreational athletes as well. It's really important in the context of this research field to remember that the elite athletes are the exception, and the majority of people that take part in contact sport are amateurs, recreational players, and youth players especially. So the research has to reflect this as well, so that it's not just research that serves the elite athletes. And then finally, a lot of the policies within this research field are concerned with things like what age participants players can tackle, or players can head the ball. But unfortunately, this isn't based on a lot of evidence that says at this age it's safer than at this age. So this is another area of the research that it needs to go down that direction. So that brings me to the end. I'd like to say thanks for the opportunity to present. It's been really interesting to open my dissertation after 6 months of not looking at it. Also, I'd like to say that we are open for recruitment as a study. So if you live in the UK or Ireland, you don't have a diagnosis of dementia, you're aged over 40, and you have any sporting background, recreational through professional, contact or non-contact sport, you're very welcome to check out our website to see if that's something you're interested in taking part in. But yeah, thank you very much.